War by Karl von Clausewitz. Read by Steadyy Ddελτα. Chapter 1. What is War? Part 1. Introduction. I propose to consider first the various elements of the subject, next its various parts or sections, and finally the whole in its internal structure. In other words, I shall proceed from the simple to the complex, but in war, more than any other subject, we must begin by looking at the nature of the whole, for here, more than elsewhere, the part and the whole must always be thought of together. Part 2. Definition. I shall not begin by expounding a pedantic literary definition of war, but go straight to the heart of the matter, to the duel. War is nothing but a duel on a larger scale. Countless duels go to make up a war, but a picture of it as a whole can be formed by imagining a pair of wrestlers. Each tries through physical force to compel the other to do his will. His immediate aim is to throw his opponent in order to make him incapable of further resistance. War is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. Force, to counter opposing force, equips itself with the inventions of art and science. Attached to force are certain self-imposed, imperceptible limitations, hardly worth mentioning, known as international law and custom, but they scarcely weaken it. Force, that is, physical force, for moral force has no existence save as expressed in the state and the law, is thus the means of war. To impose our will on the enemy is its object. To secure that object, we must render the enemy powerless, and that, in theory, is the true aim of warfare. That aim takes the place of the object, discarding it as something not actually part of war itself. Part 3. The maximum use of force. Kind-hearted people might, of course, think there was some ingenious way to disarm or defeat an enemy without too much bloodshed, and might imagine this is the true goal of the art of war. Pleasant as it sounds, it is a fallacy that must be exposed. War is such a dangerous business that the mistakes which come from kindness are the very worst. The maximum use of force is in no way incompatible with the simultaneous use of the intellect. If one side uses force without compunction, undeterred by the bloodshed it involves, while the other side refrains, the first will gain the upper hand. That side will force the other to follow suit. Each will drive its opponent toward extremes, and the only limiting factors are the counterpoises inherent in war. This is how the matter must be seen. It would be futile, even wrong, to try and shut one's eyes to what war really is from sheer distress at its brutality. If wars between civilized nations are far less cruel and destructive than wars between savages, the reason lies in the social conditions of the states themselves and in their relationships to one another. These are the forces that give rise to war. The same forces circumscribe and moderate it. They themselves, however, are not part of war. They already exist before fighting starts. To introduce the principle of moderation into the theory of war itself would always lead to logical absurdity. Two different motives make men fight one another: hostile feelings and hostile intentions. Our definition is based on the latter, since it is the universal element. Even the most savage, almost instinctive passion of hatred cannot be conceived as existing without hostile intent. But hostile intentions are often unaccompanied by any sort of hostile feelings, at least by none that predominate. Savage peoples are ruled by passion, civilized peoples by the mind. The difference, however, lies not in the respective natures of savagery and civilization, but in their attendant circumstances, institutions, and so forth. The difference, therefore, does not operate in every case. but it does in most of them. Even the most civilized of peoples, in short, can be fired with passionate hatred of each other. Consequently, it would be an obvious fallacy to imagine war between civilized peoples as resulting merely from a rational act on the part of their governments, and to conceive of war as gradually ridding itself of passion, so that in the end one would never really need to use the physical impact of the fighting forces. Comparative figures of their strength would be enough. That would be a kind of war by algebra. Theorists were already beginning to think along such lines when the recent wars taught them a lesson. If war is an act of force, the emotions cannot fail to be involved. War may not spring from them, but they will still affect it to some degree, and the extent to which they do so will depend not on the level of civilization, but on how important the conflicting interests are, and on how long their conflict lasts. If, then, civilized nations do not put their prisoners to death, or devastate cities and countries, it is because intelligence plays a large part in their methods of warfare, and has taught them more effective ways of using force than the crude expression of instinct. The invention of gunpowder and the constant improvement of firearms are enough in themselves to show that the advance of civilization has done nothing practical to alter or deflect the impulse to destroy the enemy, which is central to the very idea of war. The thesis, then, must be repeated. War is an act of force, and there is no logical limit to the application of that force. Each side, therefore, compels its opponent to follow suit. A reciprocal action is started, which must lead in theory to extremes. This is the first case of interaction and the first extreme we meet with.